Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead. I want Donato to do all the talking, so that's why he's here, really. Yes, well, I first of all, I have to say that I have written a novel, one novel. I thought that I would write it 50 years ago. Not the same one, but I thought that I would be a novelist 50 years ago. And so I will wait now while you all download it from Amazon, because it's available. There is a Portuguese version, isn't it? Or
Yes.
is it the Brazilian? Is it
Brazilian one.
So, in whatever language, because it's been translated into 20 languages. So, I'll wait while you download it. It's the only way I can make it into a bestseller. It's called Consumed in English, Divorati in Italian. Yes. Verzehrt in German. Anyway, so it was very exciting for me to actually finally write a novel. It took me 8 years to write, not sitting at my desk for 8 years, but I made 4 movies while I was writing it. So I would come back to it after every movie that I made until I finally finished it. But I began thinking that I would be a novelist. My father was a writer. I used to fall asleep to the sound of his typewriter. First it was a manual typewriter, and then it was an IBM Selectric typewriter, which was very noisy. And he was always very interested in the latest technology, as I am. And I really thought I would be a writer. And I was somehow seduced by cinema along the way, and started writing screenplays instead of writing fiction. But at a certain point, the desire to write a novel overpowered me, and I began to wonder if this is because I'm saying goodbye to cinema and hello to literature again, you know, because I have the feeling that I'm finished with cinema. It's just an instinct. It's not a rational thing. And I'm not sure why that is. It could be that I think that there are things that I want to express that I cannot express in cinema anymore, and that I need, therefore, a different art form. I'm aware that in some ways people think, you know, perhaps the novel is an old-fashioned Victorian art form that is no longer compelling, no longer alive. And that would be okay with me, because when I thought I would be a novelist, I wanted to be an obscure novelist. That is, you know, a novelist that nobody ever read. Because I used to discover writers myself who were very unknown, who were not known, and that was always very exciting to me, to be some voice of a novelist who maybe I was the only one reading that book, you know. Of course, the internet has made all of this quite different, but in any case, that's the setup for the discussion.
Well, we've been talking about this for some time now, and I remember that when David was thinking of writing the novel, I set up an appointment between him and Umberto Eco, because Umberto Eco was thinking of shooting a film at the time.
That's right.
So, having the privilege of knowing them both, we went to dinner. Eco was touring with his latest book on beauty and ugliness. So they sat down, and ultimately what came out is that it's really always a question of transcodification. The idea is you have an artistic mind, you have ideas, you have things that you'd like to produce, and then you could produce them in writing, you can make a film, you can write a poem.
Or you could make a car. You remember we also had another adventure.
Yes.
we had another adventure. This was courtesy of Donato, where he introduced me to
and it's a very famous Italian designer in Milan. No, it wasn't Pininfarina. It was doesn't come.
I forget.
I forget too.
He's very famous.
Famous, yes.
And
One of the Ferraris or something?
yes, he's
No,
he's
yes, Ferraris and
Or something.
he's designed
It'll come to
Ferraris.
me,
Yeah, yeah. And so I went to talk to him, and I said, you know, I've always wanted to design a car because I was very obsessed with cars and racing. And he said, I've always wanted to make a film. So I said, okay, you give me your studio, and I will give you my studio. Of course, he had a real studio. I didn't.
And so it's always a question, because ultimately the mode of production is very important. And people tend to forget that, in the sense that I'm sometimes an extremist. I am a professor of theater and of semiotics and other things. But what I say is, if I'm going to really, should I be speaking about film? Should I really be speaking about theater? Because technically, if the artist decided to make a film or decided to write a play, it's because the artist believed that that was the way in which his thoughts could be better or best exposed, that there's no other way, that the unsayable can only be said in that form. So technically, the form in which something is produced should then be used to comment that thing. So technically, if you're a film critic, you should not write words to describe a film or to critique a film. You should make a film or a theater. Now, this may seem paradoxical, but I think it's important to determine the importance of what medium is used. In David's case, it is really very complicated, as everything David does, in a very positive way. What people must understand, and the way I see David, is that he is a prism. And a prism has many faces, but each face is part of who David is. Not only when he uses different mediums, the novel, which I had the privilege of reading as soon as before it came out, and which is extremely well written. It's not a story. It's not something that someone who's a filmmaker decides to write her or his memories or decides to write a script. No. Divorati, Consumed, is a novel which is stylistically very strong, which has been praised all over the world, except for one exception, but for personal reasons. I think you were attacked by that critic. All over the world, there was a recognition that we are dealing with a novelist. David Cronenberg, novelist, which is one of the facades, it's one of the faces of his mode of production. Even if we look at his films, for example, although the medium is different, something that I don't think many people have actually noticed is that very often within the film, you'll have the characters speak in a different way, in a different style. So you have a cinematic style, which is the most important for the filmmaker, but you also have a style of the dialogue, which is part of the script, which in a film is less important than the visual. So the understanding here for me is that what we have is someone who, in a given moment, has decided for now that the mode in which he is going to express what is otherwise unsayable. You know, one of the big issues I have that today everyone's a writer, everyone's a poet. I went to a conference on poetry, and you know, these poems that, oh, when I was a child, my father never looked at me, and then my mother used to cook and I didn't eat. Write an essay. Words, productions are not things that need to be said. They're also things that need to be said, but the mode, the way in which they are said, needs to be otherwise unsayable. And that's why I believe that the moment in which David decided to write a novel is because what he needed to say in those terms could only be expressed in a novel and not in a film. And the moment in which there will be the impulse to say something, and he'll be there because I know that he's thinking of writing a novel, and he'll feel that the novel may not be adequate to express what you want to express. He might write a play or do another opera. We were
Or
just
to make
talking
a
about
car.
that today.
Or to design
a car. Because, for example, The Fly was made into an opera a few years ago, which he directed in Paris. So the idea is that the mode of production, what is being produced, will ultimately be, from my point of view, cannot really be decided a priori. It will be something that will have to come into life according to what unsayable things David decides to say, and in what form.
Could you tell me how I'm like a prism again? Because I think I might ask you to marry me, if you do. When I wrote the novel, one of the things that surprised me was how different it is from screenwriting. Screenwriting is a very strange, hybrid, monster kind of writing because the quality of the writing is not important. It's ironic. The only thing that matters in screenwriting is the dialogue. That's what ends up on the screen. But your descriptions, I've read some scripts by frustrated novelists, and they're terrible scripts because they spend so much time describing the beauty of the woman's face and her lips and stuff. And you're going to cast an actress who doesn't look anything like that. So it's a waste of time. You just say, she's beautiful, she's 33, she's sexy, she's tough. That's it. You don't go into detail because you might cast somebody who is, completely, who fits that category, but you can't describe her in anticipation. Also, the actress that you go to turns out to be 24, and she's insulted that you really wanted someone who was 35. So you have to be very careful when you write a screenplay, because it's really a sort of a blueprint for many people to work from. It's completely different when you write a novel, because, and my surprise was, first I'll take a drink, that I found that writing a novel was very much like directing, much more like directing than it was like screenwriting, because you cast it, you do the lighting, you do the costumes, you do the locations, and you do the editing, and all of this is much more like directing than I expected. And so I felt very comfortable, really. I mean, of course, your relationship with the words is different, and you have to be able to have the words to do the proper casting and directing and location and costumes and so on. But so it was, I thought, is it a superior form of directing, writing a novel? Superior to directing cinema? That was my question to myself. I remember I did an interview with Salman Rushdie when he was in hiding. I went to London to do an interview with him, and was taken to a hotel that he was in, a secret hotel, and I asked him, whether he felt that writing was a superior form of art to cinema. He said, "No, I'm trying to direct a film." He said, I said, "Well, you're going to have to get out of hiding first, because when you direct a film, you're very much in the public eye, So it turns out, of course, he loves cinema. He also thought, by the way, that he wanted to race cars too. So we had a lot to talk about. I don't think he's done either of those, but he continues to write.
I can tell you a story about that as well.
Yes.
When I made the film with Raoul Roos called Time Regained, he saw the movie in London, and he calls us telling that Raoul could adapt any of his books, and we made an adaptation of The Ground Beneath Her Feet.
Oh, yes, yeah.
And once he read the script, he didn't tell anything, it was okay, But one day he's telling me, "Paulo, I wrote a script as well, and I think mine is better than yours." And we have a big talk together. And it's true that the script was, for me, so far away of the genius of the book. And I told him that, this, we wrote a fantastic script, a fantastic book, and the script is not the same. It was so, what you say, academic, academic, you can say, and it's incredible because someone could, have this, this relation with his own work,
Well, I had a slightly similar experience because the first time I adapted a novel for the screen was Stephen King's Dead Zone. And there were 5 scripts that had been written, and one of them had been written by Stephen King, and it was by far the worst. It was, and I said, if I do this, use this script for the movie, your fans will kill me because they'll think I have destroyed your book. Because he didn't really pay attention to what was good in his book. It became more about a crazed serial killer, and it was just completely quite different from what attracted me to the book. So, but that was my first experience trying to find a way to recreate. I came to feel that people talk about adapting a book for the screen. And I said, no, there's no way you can adapt the book to the screen. You have to destroy the book. You have to betray the book in order to be faithful to the book. You destroy it and you recreate it in such a way that the people who love the book will feel that they're seeing the book, but they won't really be. And people feel that way about my film, The Dead Zone. They think that, yeah, that's the book. It feels just like the book. But in fact, it's very different from the book.
Well, also with Naked Lunch. So the ability is this. It makes no sense, because if someone writes a book, a great book, it's finished. The moment in which you do something else, you're creating another work, an independent work. And the greatness, I think, of David, who is here, is that he is able to do this using the DNA of the book. So not recreating the book, but using the characteristics where, when you see 2 people, you say, oh, they're related, I feel it, right? But they're not identical, because they can't be identical. You can't take a book and put it on the screen, and even if you could, it would be absolutely useless. So the idea is to create something new and original. And again, this tells us that on the one hand, we have David, the screenwriter, because he needs to rewrite the script for the film itself, and then we have David, the novelist. I would also like to comment on what David just said about the freedom of the script, the director in the novel, etc. It's true, but the film is more authoritarian in the sense that although the novelist can really write the details, can really decide everything in the book, ultimately it will be the reader who will transcodify everything, and no matter how detailed the book, will cast in their minds, the readers, who the woman is.
Of course, if you have no readers, this doesn't happen.
Exactly.
Then the book is perfect.
Whereas the moment in which you direct, you are actually narrowing the possibilities of the viewer to decide exactly who the person was, or the ambientation is going to be. So it is a very, very transitive way in which to produce things. And then ultimately making films, and this is, I think, perhaps the biggest problem, is that whereas if you write a novel, you really need very little, to make a film, you're going to have to find all the money that makes everything more complicated. And this is a question I want to ask David, because of this, when you are a filmmaker, do you find it do you have more restraints, in the sense that if I write a novel, we can be here and then we go to Siena and we stay 2 days in Siena and then we go to Hong Kong, and obviously in a novel it will not make any monetary difference, whereas if you're going to shoot a film, you might have to
Yes, that's always a problem. I mean, I'm a good friend of the filmmaker Guillermo del Toro, and he's written a couple of novels, and that freedom for him was very important. He said, "An army of demons, 5,000. No, 10,000." You know, because in the book it's you just change the number. In the movie, it's $3 million of computer-generated graphics. So it's for him that was that kind of freedom. Yes, the struggle when you decide that you're going to go to all those different places used to be that you maybe to make it feel authentic, you would have to travel to all those places. I can only say 2 words: Google Earth. It's really quite a different thing, and I've talked to quite a few writers, and because when I think of it, I know a lot of writers who I've met over the years, and I really think you can, in the middle of the night, 3 o'clock in the morning, you suddenly want to be walking in the streets of Matera because you're going to describe a particular moment, and you can walk that. If you use Google Earth or Google Street View, you can actually. Is that cheating? Is it different from traveling to that place and walking that street and taking photographs? Whether it's cheating or not, it works. I can guarantee you. It just becomes another tool, another. I remember some writer. There was a Canadian writer who I've talked to who at that time was extremely reluctant to ever connect her computer to the internet while she was writing her novel. But for me, it's fantastic to be connected to the internet while you're writing a novel. I mean, there are different approaches. And there are some writers, I won't mention any names, who still use an actual typewriter. It's partly really to connect with the past of writing, but also to isolate yourself so that you are not connected to the world. It's a different approach, I doubt that I myself could not have written my novel without being connected to the internet. That's also partly because my memory is so bad for things that I need to remind myself of. For example, who this car designer was, so I can see his face, I can hear his voice. I remember.
Was it Giugiaro? No?
Yes, Giorgetto Giugiaro. See, there we have it. You see, you need about 5 minds to equal 1 mind now.
It is true, but on the other hand, technology just plays such a big role in not only most of your films, but also in your novel. And really, this is not publicity. It is a wonderful novel. Again, if you read the reviews, and that really, it is so open to interpretation that the reviewers really saw it in so many ways. I'm familiar with most of the reviews, but it is really a novel that has multi-layers. And it's probably a novel that, paradoxically, would be extremely expensive to produce if it were a film. But why paradoxically? In Germany, they actually staged it as a play.
Yes, it was very minimalistic.
Very minimalist.
It was in Bremen, in the north of northern port in Germany, and for some reason there was a theater group there. They just wrote me and asked if they could have the permission to do that, and then they sent me a video of it, and it was, as I say, very minimalistic, very almost expressionistic, and very sweet. I mean, even though my German wasn't good enough to follow it, I was familiar with the material. So I was able to understand what was going on, and it was actually, by the end of it, it was quite emotionally potent. And there is a Canadian producer, Robert Lantros, who has worked with me before, who wants to make a sort of Netflix kind of series, actually it's with AMC, I think, a series based on my novel. And I said, I don't want to direct it, I don't want to write it, but I just want to be the writer who collects money each time it's shown. we'll see if that happens.
But
He's
even-
trying to get it made.
And again, just to get back to the philosophical, professorial part, I think once someone writes a novel, they should not write the script, because it's almost as if they were saying that the novel was a failure. Because if you write a novel and you're convinced it is what it's supposed to be, why would you then touch it and do something else? So the idea is, I do think that someone else should write the script.
In fact,
for
that's
that.
probably why Stephen King's screenplay of The Dead Zone was so different, because it would be boring for him to just do it again. And I had the same feeling. I thought, why would I want to even direct it? Because I've done it already. I mean, I've done it to my own satisfaction. So it would be like doing an instant remake, which, you know, is boring.
He did, however, David, another sort of book, Red Cars.
Yes, the Red Cars.
Red Cars was also a very interesting experiment where there was a script that was never produced based on a, sorry?
We show it here. I think we made an exposition. With
Yes.
King.
And, you know, it was a script that was never produced. It was on the Formula One circuit. It was about two pilots of who drove Ferraris, and Enzo Ferrari, etc., where next to the script, the people who co-edited it with David put some images where we sort of tricked people in almost having an image that would mirror the script, etc. And you would also get a little car with the book. It was three-dimensional.
Yes.
It was an interesting.
Yeah, so when you download my novel, you can also buy this book. It's quite expensive, but you know. That really opens another interesting thing, because I have to confess that my novel Consume began as a screenplay that I never finished. And I can say, too, that the novel Cosmopolis of Don DeLillo, who might be here somewhere, began as a screenplay also. So it's an interesting experience to compare my screenplay of Consumed, which, as I say, was never completed, with the novel, which to me expanded and became much more voluptuous and much more complex and so on. It doesn't mean that the screenplay might not have made an interesting movie, but it would have been maybe diminished, a diminished thing somehow.
It would be something different, not even diminished, I think. It would just be different. They're two separate works. It's something that, you know, sometimes it's, oh, Professor, oh, I preferred the book over the film. That makes no sense. It's absolutely, one should not say it. There are two independent works, and they should be judged for their own value. Again, many, unfortunately, take a book and try to put it on screen, which is useless. But on the other hand, if you reproduce the idea, if you take the DNA and put it there, it becomes another work of art that has a connection with it, but it's something different.
You can usually tell when an adaptation of a novel is a failure when there's voiceover. You know, when you have somebody basically reading the novel to you, like a kid at bedtime, to explain the movie. You know, to me, that's a failure. There are very few movies to me that work with using voiceover. You know, because the frustration is that in a novel, even in a very bad novel, you can be inside the head of the character, and you can know what they're thinking. That's very hard to do in a movie, because it's the temptation is to have someone reading their mind over the imagery. In a movie, really, you have to reveal what people are thinking by their expressions, by their body language, by the way that you frame things, and by their dialogue. But you don't have what you can have in any novel, which was an interior monologue. You know, I walked down the street, but I wasn't really seeing the street. I was thinking about my dog and my Ferrari, you know. And how do you do that in a movie? You can't, you know. So you have to show the dog and the Ferrari. And then depends on how expensive the dog is. It could be very expensive. So I've adapted. I realize, to my surprise, I've made movies of quite a few books, including Cosmopolis and Dead Zone and Crash, and J.G. Ballard's Crash, which for years I thought I found the book repulsive. You know, I actually, Jeremy Thomas was the English producer. He said, I know J.G. Ballard. I really think we should make a movie of Crash. It's perfect for you. I started to read the book. I said, I can't read this book. It's you know, and then about 5 years later, I met Jeremy at the Toronto Film Festival, and to my surprise, I said, I think we should make Crash. And he said, I will immediately introduce you to Jim Ballard. And it only took me it took me maybe a week to write the script. I was ready. Somehow it had percolated, and the way to adapt it and why I would want to adapt it, it had happened unconsciously. So there's that strange relationship. And once again, the book is obviously different, but people, and including Ballard himself, who really loved the movie, felt that it was somehow the cinematic equivalent of the book. That's a mysterious kind of thing.
And also a dangerous method, also. That's
yeah.
From a play.
Yes, A Dangerous Method was based on Christopher Hampton's play about Jung and Freud. And once again, I mean, it was he wrote the screenplay, Christopher, and then we made changes and stuff. But once again, it's obviously very different from the...
And you don't think that if you find a book that you still read a lot, I think, no?
Yes, I do, yeah.
If you find a book, these coming back to the cinema is something that will happen. That's normal, because...
I haven't really shut any doors. It's just Paolo was responsible for my making Cosmopolis. He came to Toronto and gave me this book, and I said, don't come to Toronto with a book, because I hate that. I never do that. I always hate every book. And then 6 days later, I had written the script, and I said, yeah, okay, we make the movie. That was unusual, very unusual. So I don't close the door to that, but you know, my son has made a film, a movie called Antiviral, which he directed, and we were in Cannes together, and it was the first time that there was a father and son who were on the red carpet together at Cannes, and that was very wonderful. But I see what he goes through as a young independent filmmaker. You know, financing comes, it goes, it falls out. There's new financing, but they don't like the actress that you cast, and it just, that kind of thing can be very disheartening. And I'm not sure that I have the desire to suffer. You have to have a desire to suffer, you know. There's a story about the great writer Nabokov, the Russian writer Vladimir Nabokov, and he was giving a speech about writing, and a student said, Mr. Nabokov, you know, I want to be a writer, but I don't know, I haven't really suffered in my life. I haven't really suffered the way you have to suffer. And Nabokov said, you know, when I go to my tailor, I say, I want the pockets to be crooked. And the tailor says, don't worry, the way I make suits, they're always crooked. He said, don't worry, you will suffer enough. And that proves to be true. So whether I continue to want to suffer, I don't know. We'll see. We'll find out.
Well, unfortunately, the film industry has changed a lot in the past 20, 30 years, in the sense it's really now governed mostly by bankers and by lawyers, etc. And what David is saying is absolutely true. 30 years ago, an artist like David would be able to really produce anything he wanted. And it was the pride of the producers or the company to have in their library a film by Fellini, a film by Antonioni, etc. So it really, I think, that although it may be painful, although it may be something you do not want to confront because you don't want to deal with all these things, if you find it that the only way you can express your idea, the only way you can realize your message is through film, you'll probably be ready also to make that compromise again.
I think your feeling that there was a golden age of cinema where anybody could do anything is actually never existed.
I don't think that anyone can always do.
It never existed. I mean, people. I've talked to Martin Scorsese often about this because people think Martin Scorsese, he can do anything he wants, obviously because he's Marty and he's. No, it doesn't happen. I remember when he was doing The Last Temptation of Christ, and he wanted to cast Christopher Walken as Christ. And the studio that was financing it said, we don't want Christopher Walken in that role. But because we have so much respect for you, we will not say, you must cast someone else. Instead, we will say, we're not doing the movie. This was how they showed respect. So he ended up having to find independent financing and ended up casting, in fact, Willem Dafoe instead, but still. So I think as much as I would like to believe that there was that golden era, I don't think it ever was. There was always, where money is involved, there's always a problem. You know that as a non-capitalist, former Marxist, maybe Trotskyist, I'm not sure.
But now there is another way of producing, with Netflix, that with all the money.
Well, that's a whole different thing, yes. I mean, the Netflix has really opened the door to a whole new era of filmmaking, and that's a whole other discussion, but it's an interesting one.
And you did turn down something, wasn't it? That detective series that they asked you to.
Yeah, I've turned down a few things, but that wasn't because it was a series. It was because you didn't of the specifics. Yeah, of the script was not good.
So the idea is that if something good comes along and there is money attached to it.
It depends on how much of that money is mine. I say that with humor, because, that's usually not the issue. But in any case, maybe we've talked enough, do you think?
You want to...
Have we anything more interesting to say, really?
Matthew wants to make
What is this part in writing that fulfills you that you don't find in films anymore for the moment?
What is
this part in writing that fulfills you that you don't find in writing anymore for the moment?
I think it is the complexity of the inner monologue. The way that your mind, while you're having an experience, you can you start to relate it to your own past, to things you've read, to art, to society. You can do all this in writing easily. Well, easily if you're good at it. And in cinema, some of those things are impossible. I really think there are things that you can do in either art form that are not doable in the other art form. And it's the subtlety and the complexity of the way a mind works that I find entrancing in writing, and something that I don't think I've been able to do that in cinema. So that's basically it. I mean, and does that make it a superior art form? No, it makes it a different art form. But in some ways, maybe superior. I really am attached to the idea of philosophy, and in my novel, I have two characters who are kind of like Simone de Beauvoir and Sartre. Although my Sartre character is also a little like Dominique Strauss-Kahn, so there's a difference. But the idea of having a philosophy of life and living it and nurturing it and communicating it, I find it very difficult to express in film. If you're thinking of that and you saw all my films, you would see attempts to do that. There's discussion of philosophy in most of the films in some way or another, sometimes directly, sometimes not. But I think it's not even that I think you must have a philosophy to live, you know, but the idea that we feel compelled to do that, to give meaning to our life, that I find more accessible in literature. I do. That's it. That's a good question. It's the basic question, actually.
Good evening. It was said earlier that you shouldn't compare the movie adaptation to the book, and this is, for me, it links to a much more broad matter. I would like to ask you both if two pieces of art that are made, excuse me, in two different art forms should never be compared. In terms of meaning that I should say I prefer one to another. Them being on two different art forms or two different types of expression, does it make them uncomparable?
Well, for me, yes.
You start.
So I think they're two different works of art, and they you know, as we said, you can speak of the genesis, etc., but you can't say that one is better than the other because they're really independent. Someone who really did a lot of this, and one of my main interests is also, and I had sworn I wasn't going to mention him, is Luigi Pirandello. Luigi Pirandello is someone who just continuously did this thing, and he wrote a short story, and then he made a play, and then he made an opera, and then he wanted to make a film, etc. But because he was eternally not dissatisfied with what he was doing. So that was the only reason, and also the money reason, because Pirandello always needed money, so he kept on reinventing things in order to make money. But the works of art need to be separate because they are independent in many ways. And that's how I feel. And one doesn't diminish the other in the sense that they can both be great. They can, you know, just like a translation, you know, always the original is better. Well, no, because sometimes even a translation is different than the original. One of the translations I read in Italian of Moby Dick, I found to be, at the end, different, even though the story is exactly the same, but it was different from the novel I read in English by Melville.
Yeah.
So they're always kind of separate.
Yeah, I mean, I've at times tried to combine, you know, the two. I mean, Naked Lunch is really my attempt to devour William Burroughs, you know, as a writer. And in fact, when it was proposed to me, once again by Jeremy Thomas, to do a movie of Naked Lunch, I said, I met Burroughs, and I said, you know, I can't really make a movie just of your novel, though it's a great novel. I need to incorporate your life as a writer into the movie, including the very crucial moment where he shot his wife and killed her, and your ambivalent attitude towards your own homosexuality at a certain time in your life, which you wrote about in your book Queer. And Burroughs said, I don't separate my life from my art at all. Do whatever you want. You can have it all. And so that was my attempt, you know, because when you think of it, a writer who writes is, in cinematic terms, there's nothing more boring, you know. It's a man or a woman sitting there typing, hour after hour after hour. This is not very exciting. So I needed to find a way to express in cinema the the excitement and the complexity of the writing process as it is to the writer, not to someone watching the writer. That's why I came up with these insect typewriters and so on, which are not in Burroughs's work, but it was my expression of his process of writing. You know, so I've tried to combine them. You know, and to me that was an interesting thing to do, and I was happy with the film that resulted. You know, but it's still not the same as Burroughs writing his books. You know.
One thing I would like to understand, maybe, it's true that cinema, you know, has a kind of fascination, you know, mostly of the artists, you know, all writers, painters, everyone, in a way thinks they can direct a movie and they want to direct. And I think in this festival we show a lot of, you know, cinematographic work of artists that are not. But why? Because cinema is easier than the other arts? Because they think so. I don't think it's easier, but they think it's easier because, on the contrary, a lot of directors that they, except some of them, they don't feel that they are capable to write a novel. You know.
Yeah, I think. Well, that's an interesting point. I mean, you've had Julian Schnabel here,
yes,
who is a painter, of course, a famous, successful painter, who's recently directed, well, relatively recently, what, 4 or 5 movies. But I don't think he's doing it because he thinks it's easy. I think he's doing it because he respects the power of cinema. And you know, an artist, even one as successful as he is, has a very limited audience in a way, especially if you think of seeing his paintings for real in front of you in a gallery rather than seeing just reproductions of them. So it's the power of cinema that I think is what they want, is to have that magic, you know, to be able to learn how to manipulate that magic, to use it to have a different audience. You know, that's what I think is going on.
And a much bigger audience.
And a much bigger audience, yeah.
So that's, and perhaps even what we were saying earlier, the need to express his ideas in a different way. Maybe, you know, paintings would not fulfill that. He needs something else, and it can be, as we said, other things.
I think.
David, do you believe that a novel can be unadaptable, like Terry Gilliam likes to call an unfilmable project? I think this was deeply discussed when, by the critics with Paul Thomas Anderson adaptation of Inherent Vice from Thomas Pynchon. Do you think that, like, for example, Thomas Pynchon book can be unadaptable? Or
well, although there was relatively recently there was an adaptation of a Thomas Pynchon novel, one of his recent novels rather than one of his earlier, more complex novels. I didn't think the movie really was successful. I'm trying to remember. It was with Joaquin Phoenix, you know.
In the one did Paul Thomas Anderson, that one.
I forget.
Yeah.
Yes, I think that's.
Yes.
I think that's the one. Well, as I've said here, and as I believe, all novels are not adaptable. You know, I think you can't really adapt them, so you have to recreate them. You have to you create in a way another thing in the cinema. It really depends on what your understanding of the word adaptation means, you know. But my feeling always was that if you start to work on a novel for the cinema with the idea that you will be absolutely faithful to the novel, you are doomed. You will never make a good film, you know. You will end up reading the book over the movie. So you have to create something new. And I think I could make a movie of Pynchon's first novel, a fantastic novel. it's so complex and so difficult. You can't make it, you can't make it into a movie, but you could make something called V, a movie by David Cronenberg based on the novel by Thomas Pynchon. It would be something, and it would be something I felt with Naked Lunch, that I was fusing my blood with Burroughs. We were creating something together, rather than I was being a faithful, to his work. And that was the only way that it could be done. I felt the same way with Crash, with Ballard. And also, I must say also with Cosmopolis, even though Cosmopolis in some ways was a more direct adaptation, if you call it that, because every line of dialogue in the movie was from the book. There was only one or two tiny changes. But even then, there were things that were in the book that were left out, changes in structure.
Because the problem is the code. It's what you have is a transcodification. So you can't take a written code and make it visual. It just can't happen. So when we speak of adaptation, I think, and I hope David agrees, is you get the idea and then you do something with it that gives you the spirit. Honestly, Naked Lunch, the film, really, for someone who knows the book, even though it doesn't follow the book 100%, gives you what the book expresses, plus things about the author that are implicitly in the book and that in the film are perhaps more explicit. But the idea is that they're two different codes and thus not comparable, really.
Hello. As a poet and a writer, I am interested in knowing also the reference or the links with some certain books, authors, and also with music. What do you like to listen to, or what are you reading now? I'm interested in that. In some way you answer in the first question, because I was going to ask you also the relation with philosophy. During your life you have said that making a movie, film, is like a philosophical exploration. And so I'm interested in that. And I would like to know also what's your relation with dreams and nightmares. If you have the dreams and nightmares just okay, or you have written down, there's a lot of writers that nightmares or dreams, and and the authors.
Yeah, I don't really, I must confess that I do not find dreams and the occasional nightmare to be part of my creative process at all. When you
Personal, I mean, if you have a nightmare or something.
you want to know personally if I have nightmares? Because you think I must. I think I've had maybe 2 or 3 in my entire life, that's all, that I remember. And they were terrifying, but only a couple. And they were, it's like, we go back to the 60s, when we would all smoke hashish, and then suddenly on the inside of the cigarette pack, we would write something because we had discovered the secret of the universe, and we would write it there, and we would say, man, oh wow. And then the next morning we would wake up and we would read this, and it was completely incomprehensible and meaningless. So in a way, that's the nightmare experience. When you have it, is so compelling, and then you wake up and you think, well, that is not scary at all, and it's the tone of it. It's the tone of it that was terrifying. And when you wake up, the tone is gone. You have the narrative. You can see what you what happened in the dream or nightmare, but it doesn't have the tone. Of course, so really, if you want to make a great horror film, I've made a couple of horror films. It's the tone that it's not really just the narrative. It's the tone that you have to create, and that's very difficult because it's not just the story. It's the feeling, it's the music, it's the lighting. Everything has to work to give you the feeling of a dream or nightmare. With writing, though, I must say, and even when I was writing scary screenplays, it really it's comes from my fingers. I mean, I feel like it's coming out of my fingers. Typing. It's strange. It doesn't really come out of the experience of my life at that point. It's odd, and it's actually in writing. I love that feeling. It's a beautiful feeling that everything is coming out of your fingers and into these. That's my handwriting is so bad, that I couldn't even remember. I couldn't read what I've written. So I've always used either a typewriter or a word processor. But I feel that there are people who say that they could not, they have to write it with their hands, but it's the same thing. It's a physical thing. That's where it comes from, more than anywhere else.
And what about your readings, the authors you like?
Yes, I mean, of course, reading is how you learn that how literature works for you as a person. But I don't think it's true that early on I was really read a lot of Burroughs and I read a lot of Nabokov, very different writers, and some of my early writings were imitative of those writers, and I felt that I couldn't escape their influence for a long time. Whereas in the cinema, I had, and I'm not being arrogant here, in the cinema I was free because I had no influence. There was no one filmmaker who dominated my mind the way, let's say, Hitchcock dominated Brian De Palma, for example, for his early films. I loved Fellini, I loved European filmmakers, but I also loved American films. There were so many filmmakers that I loved that there was no one dominating influence, So I actually felt much freer when I started to write my first screenplay than when I tried to be a writer. But then, of course, more recently, I feel that all the writers have kind of settled down in my nervous system, and there was no longer an influence that was so extreme that I couldn't escape it. That's how it felt to me.
Hi, David. Thank you so much for being here, first of all. My name is Katerina. And so when you said that in a book you could go deeper into the human's minds and into the complexity of the human's mind, my first thought, and maybe it was because I work as an actress, is that, okay, so maybe us as actors, we are not able to give that complexity with our eyes or with, and then I think I understood, you said it's more about the inner monologue and how you don't like putting voice off in films, and so it's not a problem of the actor not being able to do this, it's more a problem of the complexity is just too complex for
yeah. Yes, no, it's not. No, I mean, it's such a different process when you're working with an actor. There's nothing comparable when you're writing a fiction. It's true that sometimes you have a character that you're writing in a novel that surprises you and takes over and goes in a direction you didn't expect and says things that surprise you. And that is something like what happens with actors. If you have a really good, my voice is starting to go. If you have a really good a really good actor that you have a good collaboration with, that actor will surprise you with the interpretations and without inventing dialogue, let's say, but will surprise you with an interpretation, a subtlety of movement, something. And so it's quite a wonderful thing. But it's when you're making a movie, that's you. The actor is the material that you're working with. I mean, that's the clay that you're molding and you're working with, and so on. And it's not really clay because it's like the golem clay, you know. It's a living clay. I don't know if I'm making any sense now, but I find that, you know, there's those slight crossovers in feeling, as I say, that character that you're writing can, out of your fingers, surprise you. But it's not the same as an actor surprising you, you know. They're kind of parallels, but not exactly the same.
Thank you so much. And
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, David. Thank you, Donato. Thank you. It was really a fantastic moment.